Okay, well, our first speaker this morning has come from California. And I've said before yesterday, a lot of our authors are very diverse. They come from a lot of different backgrounds. Well, James Wawro is the same. He's a trial lawyer. So it makes you, and they're not laughing at you, they're laughing at what I said yesterday. I guess people think the ones who are involved in New Age are just kooks out there. Believe me, they're not. Two of our authors yesterday were in the corporate field, and so they're all different professions, and they have different interests. So it shows it's a broad spectrum that goes throughout. Everyone is becoming more and more interested in the New Age field. If you want to call it that, the metaphysical field. Well, James is one of our authors, and we published his book. It's called Ask Your Inner Voice. And it just came out in time for the conference. We were really pushing to get everything here and done at the same time. Ask your inner voice. But, everyone has that little small voice that you don't pay attention to. It's all there if you'll listen to it. So that's what his book is about, what he's going to talk about this morning. I was going to say, James Wawro.
I'd like to thank Dolores for that fine introduction. I'd like to thank everyone for getting up very early in the morning to come to this presentation. And without further ado, let me tell you how I've gotten started on writing a book called Ask Your Inner Voice. I was born and raised in Rochester, New York, although I live now in California, San Luis Obispo, halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. From a very early age, I knew that I wanted to be a lawyer, and that was kind of an inner voice thing. I didn't recognize it at the time, but that certainly was it. I went to Cornell Law School. I became a lawyer. I worked as a trial lawyer on Wall Street for a large firm. I had my own firm in Los Angeles for a number of years, and I ultimately ended up as a senior partner in a 1,400-lawyer international law firm that was headquartered in Los Angeles. Now, what I found as I was trying cases is that I began to get powerful, intuitive experiences. And you can imagine when you're dealing with people and you're dealing with something like a trial, that can certainly happen. During the time that I began having these experiences, I thought, this is interesting. I should investigate this a little bit further. So I did. I took a Silva Mind course. I studied the area. I had spiritual teachers who talked about how to access the inner voice. And I realized that everyone in their life at some time has had an inner voice experience. They've had a hunch or an intuition or an inspiration. But how do you study these things? Well, I looked to science. What I found in science is that many people have tried to study the inner voice experience, but it can't be done scientifically. If you think about it, all science and all scientific experiments are based on the five senses. And the inner voice experience really is a sixth sense. People have tried. Descartes, Freud, Jung, they called it consciousness, the unconscious, the collective unconscious, cosmic consciousness. But they have all done their studies based on sort of case-by-case examples, kind of anecdotal evidence. In time, the social scientists figured that the way to study this kind of sixth sense experience is through these anecdotal sort of situations. In fact, they developed a theory which they called grounded theory, which meant nothing more than you take all of the data points that you can find from whatever you're studying, you collect them, and you see if you can develop a theory from the data that you've collected. They call it grounded theory. That is, the theory is grounded in the data. What I'd like to do today is talk about some of the experiences that people have had, starting with the kind of throughout history, about how to relate to the inner voice experience. I love that woodcut from Hildegard of Bingen, which she herself did, showing how she was receiving inner voice information from someplace outside of her mind into her mind. I also love that great painting of Joan of Arc receiving inspiration from Archangel Michael. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little about the inner voice in history. Then I'd like to talk about recognizing the inner voice. Then I'd like to talk about conscious communication with the inner voice. Talk a little bit about discernment and verification. And then as a summary, what I'd like to do is conduct an inner voice experiment in this room, where we'll go through a summary of the points that I've made, and we'll see how the inner voice comes to you. Let's look at the inner voice in history. Starting with Abraham and the sacrifice, we learn discernment. Listen to that second inner voice that says, don't kill Isaac, rather than the first inner voice that says, go ahead and do it. Jacob wrestled with an angel. He taught us about prophecy. Moses was able to hear God's voice from a burning bush. He received the Ten Commandments. Elijah, the biblical story where God appeared to speak to Elijah through an earthquake, through fire, through wind, but God was not in those things. He was in the still small voice. Apart from the Christian era and the Christian mystics, there was Buddha, who taught us about meditation and that divinity can speak to us from within. Perhaps the most famous non-Christian inner voice experiencer was the priestess at the Oracle of Delphi, where if you were a king and you wanted to initiate a war, the first thing you did is you went to the priestess and asked her to ask her own inner voice to answer the question that you had about whether you should commence this war or defend this war or whatever it was. Socrates had an inner voice. Perhaps the most famous Christian inner voice person was Jesus. Early Christian theologians believed that the inner voice is a way to reach divinity. The most famous figure in the Islamic religion, Muhammad, his revelations became the basis of the Quran. Hildegard of Bingen again, receiving the inner voice. Francis of Assisi was an important inner voice figure in the early Christian church. The great Persian poet Rumi had inner voice experiences, and the curious thing about the way he received it was through ecstatic dance. In fact, that is still incorporated into, in Turkey, the concept of the whirling dervish, who is a Muslim mystic, ascetic, who receives inner guidance from the frenzy of the dance. Joan of Arc, one of my favorite figures as a teenager, got French generals to listen to her about how to defeat the British. And not only did they listen to her, but they incorporated it, and it worked, showing once again that I think valuable information can be obtained from the inner voice. Michelangelo, I love his description of all he had to do when he had the vision from within is look at the stone, and then all he had to do is chip away the part of the stone that was not the statue. Martin Luther had a strong inner voice. Joseph Caro, the last great codifier of Jewish law, found spiritual wisdom from within, from a spiritual teacher. Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuit order, had an interesting rule that applied to all Jesuits under his control, and that is they were each assigned a spiritual advisor, and whenever they received inner voice guidance, before they acted on it, they were to check with a spiritual advisor, showing an important part of the discernment that's necessary in inner voice work. This is Dolores' field. Nostradamus, one of the most famous receivers of visions from within. Teresa of Avila, probably the greatest proponent of meditation in the Christian world, who believed that oneness with spirit was possible through meditation and pursuit of the inner voice. John of the Cross, who wrote a very famous poem that is still recognized today. It's called The Dark Night of the Soul, about the oneness of the soul pursuing its path from where it finds itself to oneness with divinity. George Fox, who founded the Quaker religion, had an interesting practice that is still involved in many ceremonies involving the Quakers today, and that is to sit silently in a group and wait for Spirit to speak. And when Spirit speaks, then the person who receives that inspiration is to speak it out. He called it expectant waiting, and it's an important part of the inner voice experience. Bach, it is said that on every piece of music he wrote in Latin, "To God alone the glory." Emanuel Swedenborg, an incredibly prolific writer and scientist who had tremendous inner voice experiences. Mozart, who received his music fully formed without any necessity of building it or grinding it out or smoothing it out. All he had to do was write it down. Famous English writer William Blake heard angelic voices. John Keats, called the sensuous mystic, who wrote those great lines, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that's all you know on earth and all you need to know." Miki Nakayama, a Japanese founder of religion, who God spoke to from within. Harriet Tubman, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, had a very interesting approach to the inner voice. She was conducting people away from areas where slavery was prevalent, and she was constantly in danger of being found out and captured. Every time she got into that situation, what she would do is ask her inner voice, "What do I do?" And her inner voice invariably told her how to elude capture. Nettie Colburn Maydern, who told Abraham Lincoln as part of a channeling exercise, "Don't hold off on enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation," and he did not. Robert Louis Stevenson, who had little people in his dreams tell him the plots of his stories, including Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. George Washington Carver, who, as he worked on his agricultural studies, would be constantly asking his inner voice for wisdom, and his inner voice would constantly be giving him answers. Great Native American shaman Black Elk had discussions with the spirit that guides the universe. Rudyard Kipling, who had an inner daemon who told him of the stories that he was to write, and when the inner daemon finished speaking, the story was finished. He couldn't add to it. Gandhi, the one expression that really says it all, is the one that he frequently used: "The only tyrant I accept is the still small voice within." Sri Aurobindo, a contemporary of Gandhi's, also had the inner experience of oneness with spirit, which was transmitted through his inner voice. Winston Churchill, during World War II, had many experiences where he would get premonitions of situations he should not be in, including situations where bombs would explode close to him. He would follow the inner voice, and he avoided those dangers. Edgar Cayce, perhaps the most famous American mystic, who would receive questions from people about their situations. He would ask his inner voice through the states that he achieved to do that, and received important and valuable answers. Teilhard de Chardin, a relatively little-known Jesuit in the 1940s and 1950s, who had inner voice experiences and applied it to his study of the evolution of man. His conclusion was that the evolution of man's next step was to create a global brain comprised of consciousness and information. And isn't that what the internet does? General Patton had a strong inner voice. Perhaps the greatest explanation of the inner voice experience written in the English language, in my opinion, is The Autobiography of a Yogi by Yogananda. Beautifully, beautifully written, and a very powerful explanation of the inner voice experience. Krishnamurti had the experience of finding oneness with the inner voice, with spirit, through meditation. The Peace Pilgrim, who traveled the United States for many years, setting out every day with no food and no lodging, and a request only that the universe take care of her, and the universe always did. Eileen Cady, who was a founder of Findhorn, the community in Scotland that was able to raise incredible fruits and vegetables by listening to the inner voice telling them how to do it, including the divas. And the thing about Eileen Cady is that she read my manuscript of Ask Your Inner Voice and gave me an endorsement. So hopefully I'm on the right track. Martin Luther King Jr. had many inner voice experiences, and he found that they were always accompanied by a feeling of inner calm. Okay, we've talked about the people on the historical list of inner voice experiences. And the thing that I find about them is that as Dolores was saying earlier this morning, they're incredibly diverse. They're not psychotic. They had led really spectacular lives. They were sane. In fact, they were so sane, they might be called super sane. Notice that every major religion was founded by someone who believed that God spoke to them from within. Those major religions are believed in and have been by billions of people throughout history. So I know we talk about these things are New Age related, but they're really quite mainstream if you peel away the accoutrements of it, because so many people have believed in these religions that were founded by people who believed in the inner voice. But what about regular people? There's a New York inner voice teacher by the name of Susan Shumsky who has been conducting seminars for many, many years into the inner voice experience, and she has been asking her people to set forth what they see as the benefits of listening to the inner voice. And I've listed on the screen a number of the benefits. My own experience is that it is possible to get accurate guidance to trivial questions and important questions, questions relating to health or relationships or finances, by talking with the inner voice. Today, I want to show you a few ways to get in touch with this inner voice experience. Okay, what's the first experience that we have with an inner voice? I think we all already know something about inner guidance. In fact, we all have had the experience of conscience. In fact, if you don't have the experience of conscience, society says that you're a sociopath. So, it is clear that everybody has had some guidance from within. And you know the sound of conscience, too. It's kind of part of the internal monologue. Sometimes it's stronger, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it simply says, don't do this. In fact, that's one of the things that is interesting about conscience. It's always negative. It says don't. It never tells you what to do. It always tells you what not to do. I think conscience is each person's moral compass, and it's kind of comprised of guilt and fear, but also society's norms. Now, we know that society is not always right. In fact, there are great examples in history of societal norms that were not right, like the Inquisition or like apartheid. So I think that the inner voice is more than just conscience. It's more than each person's moral compass. But I think it's also true that in all of our lives, we have had kind of an inner inspiration that was positive, that told us what to do instead of what not to do. And that experience was kind of a positive direction from within. Now, what is the inner voice then? Well, the people on the historical list called it spirit or guides or daemon or angels or God, higher self. A lot of people believe that it's kind of a spiritual radio receiver. It's the way we make the sixth sense connection. It's the way we experience the sixth sense. Other people feel that the inner voice is a continuum from hunches to intuition to creativity to actually communication with deity. For me, it is that positive inspiration from within. And for me, it's the same thing as the still small voice referred to in the Bible. Okay. How do we recognize the inner voice? Well, the sound of the inner voice is like the sound of conscience. It's the sound that you normally hear in your head, and it oftentimes can come with a feeling. It can come with a feeling of peace. It can come as a sense. But there are many voices in our heads. There's the voice of conscience. There's the voice of the normal chatter we all hear. The car needs fixing. I have to run to the store today. There's the negative inner voice, the negative critical voice, which I'm sure that we all possess. Oh, you did that wrong. Oh, nobody's going to attend the lecture. Oh, the plane's going to be late. All of those kinds of things. Well, how do we tell the difference between each of those different inner voices? There's a success coach by the name of Michael Neal who I think hits it exactly. If he says, if you want to tell the difference between the inner voice that's critical and the true inner voice and the internal monologue, the inner voice is the one that doesn't think you suck. What about the timing of the inner voice? The inner voice, in many people's experience, is a light that is always on. And it's only a matter of removing the blockages to receiving it. It can speak at any time. The best times to hear the inner voice, when the inner voice is speaking, is when the mind is quiet. Now, it can be in meditation, but that's not the only place. It can be in the shower, or it can be driving on the freeway, or it can be being near water, or it can be walking in the woods. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to listening to the inner voice, though, is not having the mind quiet enough to hear the still small voice within. Another major obstacle is not feeling worthy to hear divinity speak to you. And I think where this comes in is people feel that the questions are too trivial, or that divinity can't be bothered with whether or not their granddaughter should be doing better in school. But to me, it seems that the experience of the people on the historical inner voice list shows that the inner voice experience is a human right, that the light is always on, and that you can hear it at any time. Okay, where do we begin with figuring out how to consciously and actively communicate with the inner voice? Not just waiting for the inspirations to come, but actually seeking the inspiration. Well, let's start with what you know about inner messages. Every one of us has had a situation where when we've been at work, where a situation has arisen that we initially did not know how to solve, but ultimately we did solve it. Well, how did we do it? Creativity studies have shown that creativity is comprised of a couple of steps: research, kickback, aha, and manifestation. So you probably went through some aspect of those steps. The first step, research, you study the problem. You try to figure out why it is that you're not able to solve it. My example for this is when I have a problem around the house, I have a handyman that I work with. For example, if I have a sticking door, I go over to the door and kick it a few times, and when it doesn't open, then I call the handyman. And what he does is he comes over, and the first thing he does is he takes a little flashlight out of his pocket, and he turns that flashlight on, and he looks all around the door jamb. Looks all around the door jamb. He invariably finds where it's sticking, and he invariably fixes it. I think that's the first aspect of solving any problem, and particularly a problem at work, doing the research to see if you can understand where the problem is. The next aspect is kicking back. If you can't immediately solve the problem, what you do is you set it aside for a while. We have all said during a conversation with someone else, well, I can't remember right now that name, but give me a moment, it'll come to me. We all also have said from time to time when we're faced with a difficult decision, well, let me sleep on it. What's happening when we're doing that? What we're doing is we're turning over to our inner self these problems and questions. And invariably, the answer comes to us, like the answer at work. It comes to us. There's an aha moment. It suddenly pops into our mind. Once that happens, where am I at with my show here? Once that happens, and we receive the aha moment, then we manifest it. And the reason we manifest things is because it's part of the process. We make it exist in the world, not just exist in our minds. How do we find the steps to consciously communicate with the inner voice? Well, let's go back to what we learned about creativity and what we know about solving problems in work. The first thing that we want to do to consciously communicate actively with the inner voice is to formulate the question. And when we formulate the question, we research all of the elements of what we really want to know about the situation. And we ask ourselves, what am I really trying to find out here? Then we ask one question that is simple, clear, complete, and unemotional. Now that sounds like a lot of nebulous phrases, but you do it every day. When you do a Google search, what do you do when you search for something on the internet? Well, you ask one question, you make it simple, clear, complete, because if you don't, you're not going to get the answer. Now, a thing that you also don't do when you're doing a Google search is ask an emotional question. You've got to somehow detach yourself. You have to separate yourself from the result and from the question. My example of a very bad inner voice question that is not detached is one like this. I can have this double scotch, right? Okay, once you've got the question formulated, then I think it's important to write the question down. Why do we write the question down? It fixes it in our mind. And later on when we get the answer, of course, we can compare the question to the answer, but we can't do that if we haven't written it down. I think it's important to know that you are worthy before you get into this situation of asking the inner voice the question. Then I think it's important to quiet the mind. I think the way that you can consciously quiet the mind is something that every person in this room does every single day without realizing it. And what is that? Well, when we go to sleep, we don't go from the state of being totally awake to being totally asleep. What we do is consciously quiet the mind. And that really is all that's necessary for the inner voice experience, is to quiet the mind while consciously staying awake. In other words, stay in a form of wakeful relaxation. Now, meditation is a good place to do that, but there are other places, like we talked about before, walking in nature, driving, being in the shower. Any time when you can have a state of restful relaxation. Are there times when you can't quiet your mind? For me, there are. When I'm upset or angry or fearful or distracted, I think quieting the mind is impossible. So it's important at that time to stop and try it again at a later time. One of the biggest questions I always ask myself about the inner voice experience is, on this thing of quieting the mind, am I doing it right? And one of the ways that I found through a study of science is that there are certain mental states that are associated with a quiet mind. The alpha state is the one where you're perfectly attuned and receptive to a kind of an inner voice experience. How do you get into that experience? How do you know that you've gotten into the alpha state? Well, the way I have found to do it is I found a piece of music that was designed to do that, to entrain your mind to the inner voice state. And what I like to do is I like to play 3 minutes of that, and I just want you to close your eyes and listen to the music and see whether or not you can get the feeling of what the right attitude is for the inner voice experience. Okay, everyone ready? That's the experience. The trick to it is staying awake. That kind of wakeful relaxation is the state in which you can set your mind to finally take the important step, which is to ask the question. And I think it's important to ask the question expecting an answer. And what that's comprised of is three elements: desire, expectancy, and belief. On the desire front, you have a question, it's serious, you want to see if you can get an answer to the question. Expectancy, I know I've received inner voice guidance in the past, I know I've received inspiration, hunches, etc., and I know I can receive it again, and I expect to receive it again. And belief, I believe at least 51% that I'm going to get an answer to my question. I think the next thing is to listen intently and patiently. And to me, this is like fishing. When you go fishing, what do? You go and you throw the bait out and you wait. And you wait intently and patiently for something to come along and take a nibble. And I think it's important to approach the inner voice the same way. When you do get something, pay attention to whatever comes. The words that come to us from within can be so simple and yet so profound. I have an example of a friend who is a runner, and she started to experience problems with her heels. And she went to the podiatrist, and the podiatrist said, well, here are some shoe inserts, and here are some pills to take, and vary your running path. And she tried that, and it didn't work. She still had problems with her heels. So she asked her in her voice, what can I do to alleviate my heel pain? The answer she got was, better shoes would help. Now, how simple, how obvious. And yet, she went out and she got the better shoes. She got new walking shoes and new running shoes and new sandals, and the pain went away. Listening intently and patiently, and paying attention to whatever comes. I think the next most important thing to do is to write down the answer. The experience that we've all had as a child, I think illustrates this point. I don't know if you've ever played the telephone game where someone writes out something on a piece of paper and whispers it to the first person in the line, and the first person whispers the phrase to the second person in the line, and so on down the line, and the last person speaks out loud what they've heard. What they've heard is always totally different than what's written down on the piece of paper. So that's why we write it down. Not only that, if we've written down the question and we've written down the answer, we can compare the question we asked and the answer that we got, and we can see the wisdom of the connection between the two. In addition to that, if you keep a journal, like many inner voice listeners do, you can compare it over time, the question and the answer, to what actually happened in your life. And I think that is an important element of the inner voice experience. Once you have the answer, I think it's important to verify the answer, and we'll come back to this. Once you have the answer and you verified it, I think it's also important to live the new truth. That is, to incorporate it into your life. And the reason for that is, as you experience the inner voice, and as you work with it, and as you incorporate it into your life, you begin to trust it. And the more you trust it, the more you get of it. After a while, it becomes kind of second nature. And I think that's what you're looking for. Okay, let's look at this trust question. What is it about verifying the inner voice? Why do we do it? I think the reason for verifying the inner voice is that throughout history, there have been people who've done terrible things based on what they thought they heard from within. Now, it could be that they had some sort of distortion in their filter, or there was a darkness in themselves that resulted in this kind of position. But I don't think we want to be in that position. We want to make sure that what we're getting is what the light within us intended us to get. So how do we do this discernment, as the inner voice literature calls it? I think the first thing that we've got to do is we've got to satisfy ourselves as to the source of the message. Where did it come from? The next thing we've got to determine is whether we understood the message as it was intended. Now, as to the source of the message, we have to make sure that we're detached. That is, that it's not just our mind, or it's not just we're pulling from one result or the other. And my double scotch example is a good example of the detachment issue. The second aspect of feeling about the source of the message is, how did the message feel? Well, how would it feel if divinity spoke to you? You would feel uplifted. You would feel one with the universe. You would feel at peace. If you feel fear or upset or judgment or flattery, that's not the inner voice. Okay, once you're satisfied as to the source of the message, how about, did I understand the message as it was intended? And I think there are two elements to that. The first one is, does the message imply harmlessness to yourself and to everyone around you? I don't think that spirit is in the harm business. And so if you're getting a message that suggests harm, that's not from the inner voice. The second aspect of the discernment about whether you understood the message as it was intended was, after the session is over, does the message seem sensible? Does it seem practical, as all truth is? If it doesn't, then it's questionable. Okay, if you're still not sure about the answer that you've received, what do you do at that point? Throughout time, people have done a number of things to additionally confirm their inner voice answers. The first is to ask it another time to see if the answer is the same. Another is to do like Ignatius Loyola suggested for his people, to check with a trusted spiritual advisor. And finally, you can always ask that your action be blocked if you didn't understand the message as it was intended. Once in a while, you'll get an unusual inner voice. And I've got some examples on the screen of the unusual inner voices. The spoken to, the famous Course in Miracles, was written by Helen Schuckman, who began receiving inner messages. And the first inner message she received was, "This is a Course in Miracles, please take notes." So she was spoken to instead of asking the question. Prophecy is another example of things that come to you kind of unbidden. You didn't ask for the message, you didn't ask to be the messenger, but you've been given prophecy. The final unusual inner voice is the I am voice. Sometimes people get messages that are spoken in the sense of, before Abraham was, I am. And that certainly seems strange, speaking in the first person singular. On the other hand, if your consciousness is aligned with all that is, with spirit, it makes perfect sense to say, I am the way, the truth, and the life, because that is exactly what you are. Many people throughout history who have had strong inner voice experiences have had this kind of experience, and Jesus Christ is perhaps the greatest example. Okay, we've gone through it. What I'd like to do now is do a bit of a summary by way of an exercise that I'd like you all to try. Now, we all face issues in our lives, and I'm sure everyone sitting here today has an issue. What I'd like you to do is to think about an issue in your life and to ask a question about that issue to your inner voice right now. I'll go through the steps, and we'll play the waveform piece again. And as you're doing it, and as you're going through the steps, let's see if we can reach your inner voice. Okay. Think about the question that you want answered and go through the inner voice steps. The first is to know that you are worthy to hear, then to formulate a question, then to write your question down, quiet the mind, ask your question expecting an answer, listen intently and patiently, pay attention to whatever you get, write down your answer, verify the answer, and live the new truth. Okay? If we're ready to begin, Okay. I want to thank you for your attention today, and I want to encourage you, if you have a question relating to health, finances, relationships, or anything else, why not ask your inner voice? Try it. Thank you.
Stay here. If you have a question, come to the microphone. Anything you want to ask James?
It's in the bibliography for the book, Ask Your Inner Voice, and it's called Waveform. And you can get it on the internet for 99 cents, I think. Waveform. You know, if I remembered that right off the top of my head, I'd be in good shape. I think the fellow's name is Kenyon, Kenyon. Yeah.
Well, James, you're not going to get away without telling your story. The story about when a guy tried to rob you. Because we got a little time and nobody's asking questions. That's an interesting story.
One of my greatest inner voice experiences was coming home from work one day. I pulled into the garage underneath the condominium complex where I was staying in Los Angeles. And as I pulled into the garage, I got out of the car and opened the back door to get some stuff out of the back seat. And a nice young gentleman ran into the garage behind me. And as he came running toward me, I could hear him rack the slide and pump a cartridge into the round into the pistol that he was holding. And he requested that I give him my watch. Now, he didn't request it in exactly those terms. He used somewhat more colorful language than that. But he said, give me the watch. So, okay, I'm not crazy. Sure, have the watch with my blessing. I hope it works for you. And as I gave him the watch, and as I turned to go away, I mean, I guess our business was finished, he said, lie down in the back of the car. And when I heard that, I said, now, wait a minute. Is this guy going to try to kill me? So my immediate reaction that flashed through me was fight. Don't wait until he gets you into a position where you can't do anything. Actually fight. As soon as I got that feeling, I got another feeling that was very, very calm. It was, don't do anything. He just wants to make a clean getaway. And I realized that as the inner voice experience. And when I received that, I did what he said, and the kid just ran away. I was completely unhurt. The watch was gone. I didn't like it anyway because it was an ugly Rolex and it was too big and too gaudy. And it was a beautiful experience.
But it's hard to say what would have happened if you hadn't listened to it.
For sure.
Anybody else have any questions? Because I know you all hear these voices. And most of the time we just say, oh, it's just our imagination. We don't pay any attention to it. But it really is your other self, higher self, what do you want to call it, trying to get your attention. Your guide, your guardian angel. So it's always good to listen to it without, I think men are worse than women. You know. Because women, we have that instinct that we listen to. Men are always, saying, oh, it's nothing to it. Okay, come over here.
My question is, how have you used your inner voice in your trial proceedings?
Oh, that's a good one.
I guess the greatest inner voice experience I ever had is I was trying a case where I was defending a doctor, and he was accused of having faked up some medical records with an employer to squeeze a guy out of a job. I knew that the doctor was a young guy and that he probably wouldn't have done such a thing, but it's a matter of proving it. And so we were going along, and the trial was going pretty well until the other lawyer came in one day and said, I had my investigator go look at the records, the original records, and we had been using Xerox copies throughout the whole proceeding. And he said, the original records are full of whiteouts. There are mountains of little whiteout all over these records, and they were in the critical places. And what the other lawyer said is these records are kept sort of across the quadrangle from where the courthouse was, and so could we have them here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock so we can have my expert look at them? Now, the way experts can tell whether something has gone wrong with changing records is they have a little grid that looks like a piece of graph paper, and they put it on the over the thing that there's a question about the authenticity of the document. And if the thing is typed, it's impossible to roll a piece of paper into a carriage typewriter to type on it, to roll it back out, to make the changes, roll it back in, and type in. It's impossible to do it. So these little squares show them where the issues were. We hadn't seen these documents, and they weren't going to show up until 9 o'clock the next day. And so we were really faced with a dilemma. And the question was, do we object to this procedure about examining the documents, or do we sort of wholeheartedly embrace it? And the question was critical, because if the records had been changed, of course, my doctor's career was in jeopardy. So, okay, we all broke for the day, and I went back and I stayed up most of the night and just, kind of following these steps, writing down on a piece of paper what the options were and what do I really want to know. And what I came up with is, do I hire my own question documents examiner, or do I object to the whole process and try to block the whole thing? Well, as I was going through the issues, it finally just came to me, kind of a peaceful feeling, saying, hire the documents examiner. And so, okay, we showed up in court the next morning at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the other guy got to have his expert go first, and his expert was great. It's one of those situations where his expert testifies for you. It's just fabulous. That's what happened. I didn't even have to put my guy on the stand. But I embraced the process rather than objecting to it, and that was an inner voice experience.
Good morning, and
Morning.
thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Inge. Do you always immediately get an answer from your inner voice, or is there sometimes a time lag? And if there is a time lag, how to squeeze that back to an immediate answer?
That's a very good question. Frequently, I don't get an immediate answer to the inner voice question. Sometimes not even during the session where I'm asking it. Sometimes it will come later in the day. Sometimes it will come the next day. I usually give it a day or so, and if it doesn't come in a day or so, I ask again. Frequently, I don't get the answer. It's like fishing. Sometimes the fish aren't biting. Something that Lauren and I do is we will frequently ask together. We will develop a question together, and we'll ask the same question, maybe not in the same room or in the same session, but then come back and compare the answers. And if the answers aren't exactly the same, or we don't get an answer, we don't take the action. But if they are the same, and frequently they're in the same words, we figure that's the inner voice.
Question. You all know that if you meet somebody and you feel uneasy, there's something about them you can't put your finger on. They haven't said anything, they haven't done anything, but it's that uneasy feeling. You don't want to be around them. Well, I think I always call it your guides and guardian angels are warning you. So they say, pay attention to that. Mine are always telling me, don't drive down that street, go this way. And you say, why? My big curiosity would say, what's down that street? But you're better if you pay attention to it anyway. You have a question.
Yes. I've tried your experiment now. And what I'm asking my inner voice is, what is my question? I don't know what it is. Then the answer was, what am I waiting for? But I got the answer, and the answer says, for strength and truth.
Those are good questions and good answers.
So that's what do you call it?
Does that make sense to you? Does it make sense? Well, then that's your answer.
Good. It worked. Yes. Yes.
Well, people say, how do I know it's not my imagination? Well, if it feels right, if it feels true, no matter how weird it is, ask them more said she's been feeling inadequate, but she is adequate. She is. Everyone is.
Thank you.
You can create anything in your life. There are no limitations. You're perfectly adequate to do anything you want to do. It's just belief and trust. Well, you know that. You created this book. Okay, she's got a question. Okay. That's how strong your mind is. Okay.
Is this, yeah, it's open. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. My question is, did you have, after you wrote this book, did you have any positive feedback from family members or friends or business associates? Or did you have any repercussions in your life?
That's a good question. From my business associates, they all knew me before that as a trial lawyer. And they knew there was going to be no nonsense in my presence. And when I was going to say something, I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. And therefore, I got a little bit of curiosity, wonderment, but I didn't feel I got judgment. And one of the things that always amazes me about the world that we live in today is I'll open up my computer and I'll get a message from some guy in India who said, I was in a coffee shop today and I was just going on the internet and I saw the announcement about your book and I thought this is exactly the kind of thing I've been looking for. And it happens all the time, and that's a beautiful thing.
Well, you remember Sherry Cortland who spoke yesterday. She was in the corporate field, and she sat on her book for a long time because she was worried, what were people going to say? What were the people in the office going to say? Would they fire her? Would they be talking behind her back? So she was worried about it. But then when it came out, they didn't give her any problems. They said they started telling their own stories.
Particularly, may I add, with lawyers, they all get it. They don't say it, and they don't want to let their clients know that they're into it, but they all get it. And I'll give you a good example. When you ever are picking a jury, you're entitled to something called peremptory challenges. You get 6. That means that you can exclude anyone from the jury for no reason at all. You can exclude everybody for reasons for cause, like they're prejudiced or whatever, but you can exclude people on these peremptory challenges for no reason at all. And the lawyers use those peremptory challenges all the time, and they use every one of them because what? They're getting a feeling. If you talk to a trial lawyer about whether he relates to his inner voice, I guarantee you he's going to say that I listened to my gut feeling.
Okay, are there any more questions? Okay. But I always tell people, you only fail if you never try.
True.
You'll never know if you don't try. Those are the ones that fail.
True.
It don't matter what other people say. I think right now, to what we're entering, people are more open to this than they used to be. Used to be you really had to hide and be in the closet. Not anymore. We've got somebody else coming up here. Now it seems like people are more open and we're not the weirdos out there. Things are changing and that's good. Okay.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. I want to ask a question. Does all the answers can come from external source, not only internal? Like, for example, I have an experience that I was meant to come here to answer a few of my questions, and I found like I have answers a lot of my personal questions.
I didn't get the sense of that question. I'm sorry with the way I didn't hear your question.
Oh. All right. Can the answers that you're looking for your question can come from external source? For example, another person telling you something, approaching to you. For instance, like I felt like kind of like to come here to get some answers. I felt a call to come here to get some answers.
I understand. I think the question is, where do these inner voice inspirations come from? I think they can come from a lot of places. I think that we are tuned into other people and that we can receive messages from other people. I believe in things like telepathy. But I think on the exact question you asked, should I come here today to get some answers, I would call that an inner voice prompting. I think that's where it came from.